In this video, we're going to start looking at some of the syntax that we use with JavaScript. Some basic rules for our JavaScript syntax. JavaScript is case sensitive. Case matters. Every JavaScript statement needs to end with a semicolon, which like Java, like the Java language or like C# or C++. Each script statement ends with a semicolon. JavaScript also ignores extra white space within statements. So unlike Python, white space doesn't really matter here. Although we do pay close attention to it so that we can write clear and readable code. And lastly, when JavaScript is in strict mode, it disallows certain JavaScript features and coding practices that are considered to be unsafe. So when JavaScript was developed, it didn't do a great job of, it tried to be very user-friendly to the point where it was almost detrimental to the language. And as JavaScript has progressed, some of the ways people used to do things became not good. So the language has started to add features in to correct for some of those things, to make it a little bit of a more strict language, a little bit more structured, which keeps you from writing bad code that might have bugs in it. So we'll talk a little bit more about strict mode in a bit. So here's some code that follows the syntax rules. We'll talk more in detail about some of this, but the case, JavaScript ending with a semicolon, extra white space, and strict mode. So here is strict mode. We can see that in there. Notice it's just a string. It's not a string that's being printed. It's not a string that's being assigned to a variable. So what happens to it? We just put a string in there and nothing really happens to it as far as our program's concerned, except that the JavaScript interpreter sees that and instantly knows to go into strict mode. Okay? So it doesn't do anything else in our code except key the JavaScript interpreter that it should be in strict mode. We will talk a little bit more about that in an upcoming video. We can also split statements over more than one line. So we don't want to get our code so long that when we're reading it, we have to scroll back and forth on the screen. So we can split a statement across multiple lines. That kind of goes with that idea of white space doesn't matter. So where do you split it though? That's the key. We can split a statement after an arithmetic operator or a relational operator. So after a plus, minus, multiplication, division, equals, double equals, greater than, or less than. We can split it after an opening brace or an opening bracket or a parentheses or a closing brace. But here's where we don't want to split a line. Don't split a line right after an identifier, which is a variable. Don't split it right after a value or the return keyword. And don't split a statement after a closing bracket or closing parenthesis. Let's talk about identifiers. Identifiers are the variables, or actually variable's not a great term because it could be a constant. So what about the variables? What about the identifiers? The identifiers can only contain letters. They can contain numbers. They can contain an underscore or a $sign, and a $sign. Some important rules: even though they can contain numbers, they cannot start with a number. The identifiers are case sensitive. So lowercase dog for dog is not the same as dog with an uppercase D in it. They would be two different variables. Okay. An identifier can be any length, and we can't use a reserved word for an identifier. So any word that's part of the JavaScript language cannot be used for a variable or a constant name. And we also try to avoid using global properties and methods as identifiers. So we got to be careful that we don't name variables or constants or those things with the same name as a method or some other identifier that we have somewhere. So here's an example of some valid identifiers in JavaScript. We can have subtotal with capital S. That would be a valid identifier. Index _1 would be valid. Just the $ is actually a valid variable name or identifier. We actually use that quite often in JavaScript, and we'll see that soon. Here's some Camel case using an identifier tax rate. So Camel case means the first word is lowercase, and every word after it gets an uppercase letter. Okay. So the uppercase letters help us divide identifier names into individual words and make them a little bit easier to read. Another way to accomplish that is snake case. So here's another identifier, calculate with an underscore in between. Underscores are legal in identifiers. Calculate _ click is a valid identifier. And here's one starting with a $, an identifier that says log, perfectly okay. Going back to the camel casing versus snake casing, we have tax rate. Second word has an uppercase letter. Here's tax rate again using snake casing. You might ask, why do they call it camel casing? If you don't know, it's because these uppercase characters make little humps, kind of like the humps on the back of a camel. Snake casing, kind of the same thing. The little underscores make little undulations that kind of remind you of a snake. So email address with camel casing, here's email address with snake casing. So naming recommendations. So everything we've talked about so far, all this stuff was rules. Naming recommendations are not syntax rules, but they're good coding practices that we should and will follow. If you don't follow good naming, you'll lose points on your lab assignments. And the first rule is use meaningful names for identifiers. They need to mean something. Don't use like single letter variables, are very confusing. Nobody knows what they mean. You might use T and you mean tax rate, but in your code that's not readable, and somebody that didn't write it or doesn't know would have to go through your code and try to figure out what that T stands for when you could use the full word tax rate. So use meaningful names that actually describe what the identifier is holding. So let's go back and look at these. I can tell that this email address is holding a reference to an email address. Either way, snake casing, camel casing, doesn't matter. I know what these things are. Calculate click is an identifier for a function that calculates something when you click on it. Tax rate is a variable or that holds a tax rate. If I just use the word T or even abbreviation TR, that doesn't mean anything. So we want to use meaningful names. Okay. The second thing is you want to be consistent. Don't mix camel case and snake casing. Pick one. Pick whichever you like. When you go to work for a company, they usually have coding standards that say something, they might say, hey, we do everything with camel casing here. They might say we do everything with camel casing and we use these kind of prefixes on these variables and we have this method of doing this so that everybody understands what's going on. Use camel casing or use snake casing, but don't mix them. Just be consistent. Okay? If you start out using camel casing in a piece of code, use it all the way through. And snake casing is all lowercase. Don't use the underscores. Snake casing. If you're going to use snake casing, use all lowercase for all letters. And then don't use reserved words. Here's a whole bunch of them. You're not going to memorize them right now, but they're very familiar. If you've done any other programming languages, you've probably seen a lot of these before. But these are all reserved words. Hopefully, when you're done with this course, you'll know a whole lot more about what a lot of these do, or what most of them do. The last thing we want to talk about in here is comments. In JavaScript, we want to code comments. So we can use block comments, which take multiple lines. And to do that, we enclose our comment with a slash and an asterisk. That kind of opens the comment, and then an asterisk slash to close it. Okay, so that's a block comment. This comment can take as many lines as we need, as long as it starts with slash star and ends with star slash. We can also use single line comments, which are very similar to Java comments or C# comments, just // followed by the comment, and that makes the rest of the line as a comment. The line after that is no longer a comment. How should you use comments? You use comments to describe pieces of code that are hard to understand. They're to explain to somebody that might be looking at it what a piece of code does if it isn't blatantly obvious when you're glancing at the code. The other thing we can do with comments is sometimes we can block out a whole section or piece of code or even one line of code using a comment to disable it. So if we have a piece of code and we're not sure if it's working right, sometimes we can add a couple slashes in front of it and disable that line and see if our code runs. And if our code wasn't running and we disable that line and then it runs, we know that's where the problem was. It helps us narrow down where a bug might be in our code. And the last thing is, don't use comments unnecessarily. If you're writing good code and if you're using good descriptive names like we talked and discussed about, your code almost comments itself and it becomes very readable to somebody that's looking at it. And if you do that, then you don't need a bunch of comments to explain what it does. But occasionally there's a piece that might be confusing to people, and that's where you need to use a comment. The other thing is, at the top of your code, you should always identify yourself as the author and related information. It's always good to put that at the top of your code, especially if you're using an email address. If somebody needs to troubleshoot your code later on and have a question, they might be able to contact you. Oh, so we talked about statements. We talked about white space. We talked a little bit about strict mode. We're going to go into that later. We talked about identifiers, camel casing and snake casing. We discussed comments and commenting out code for troubleshooting purposes. All right, in the next video, we're going to start looking at data and setting up identifiers to hold and point to our data.